This video is about the Korean War, which raged from 1950 to 1953, and it's the first major war that the world experienced since the Second World War, and it happens right in the middle of the Cold War, just as tensions were rising. This is just a year after the Berlin airlift. Okay, so it's at the very beginning of the Cold War, and it's an occasion where the two sides, the USSR and the USA, clash, although not directly. Okay, the Korean War itself, just a wee bit about it. 2 million people die in the Korean War, and it wasn't the last war to be fought in Asia and that part of the world, because as you may know, there's a huge war then was fought in Laos and Cambodia and Vietnam later on. Okay, so we're going to have a look at the Korean War. We're going to concentrate in this video on why a war broke out in Korea in 1950. Right, the first question students usually ask me is, where is Korea? Okay, so Korea, if we zoom in on this map of the world here, Korea is quite close to Japan. It's a peninsula. I'll zoom in a wee bit closer. It's a peninsula of Southeast Asia. Just off the coast is Japan. Its neighbouring countries are China, and here would have been the USSR at the time. Okay, it's separated by China by a river here called the Yalu River. All right, and if you went out of Korea, you're into China. But then further down here, you've got Laos and Cambodia and Vietnam are down here. Okay, so that's where Korea is. It's in Asia. So why was there a war fought in Korea? Well, in many ways it's got to do with the way Korea was left at the end of the Second World War. Korea had been invaded by Japan. Here we have Korea again. Korea had been invaded by Japan during World War II. Okay, remember Japan had been on the side of the Germans in World War II, and it was the Americans who ended the war with Japan by dropping the bomb in Hiroshima, if you remember all that. So Korea had to be liberated from the Japanese. The Russians and the USSR and America, who were fighting together during the Second World War, liberated Korea, and the USSR came in from the north and liberated the northern part of Korea, and the Americans came in from the south and liberated the southern part of Korea, and they agreed to stop here along this line called the 30th parallel. You probably can't make out that says 30th. That's just a line in the globe, is the 30th parallel, and they agreed that they would stop somewhere along there. Okay. Now, in 1949, the USSR and the USA left Korea, but they left behind two separate governments. One in the south, ruled from Seoul, which is just here, and one in the north, ruled from Pyongyang, which is just here. Okay. All right. So South Korea then was ruled by this guy, Syngman Rhee. He was a capitalist dictator of South Korea, and he was backed by the USA. So this is the guy that was put in charge by the Americans in South Korea, ruling from Seoul. And he was quite unpopular. He's a dictator, but he's a capitalist dictator, okay? This guy was put in charge by the Russians in North Korea. He's Kim Il-sung. I'll talk about that Kim name in a moment. Kim Il-sung, he was a communist dictator of North Korea, and he had the backing of China and the USSR. Okay, just to deal with the Kim name, some of you will know Kim Jong-il. Okay, now this is the present, not this guy. This guy is the present leader of North Korea, and he's a grandson of the person we're looking at. Okay, so the Kims, Kim is a surname. The Kims are still in charge of North Korea. This guy here, I don't know who he is. Joking. Right. So, where did we get to? Right, another reason why the war breaks. So you've got these two competing ideologies, both sides of the border. And I suppose Koreans want their country unified. And what America is fearing is that the Kim talks about unifying Korea, and all of Korea becoming part of the part of the communist system. And what Americans are afraid of is this thing called Domino Theory. This was what was playing on America's mind in Asia. If Korea falls to communism, well then Vietnam will fall, and so will Cambodia, and so will Laos, so will Thailand, so will Malaysia, so will Indonesia, so will India. And before you know it, communism will be spreading around the world. What America's got to do is stop the first to save the rest. It's got to stop Korea falling to communism, because if Korea falls, the rest could fall behind it. There was another thing that was worrying America as well at the time. The USSR and China had signed a treaty of friendship. China had become a communist country just in 1949, the same year that America left Korea. So China had become a communist country under this guy, Mao Zedong. And the following year, Mao Zedong and Stalin signed a treaty of friendship. So it looked like communism was getting stronger and stronger. Okay? So, just to recap that, in 1949, China became a communist country under Mao Zedong. The USA feared that China and the USSR would now try and spread communism, and they feared the countries in Asia would fall like dominoes unless the USA acted to contain communism. Right, so the American president at the time was Harry Truman. You've come across him before with the Berlin airlift. And he was determined then, therefore, to stop communism from spreading, and his policy became known as containment. Now, so that was the background to the Korean War, but the actual trigger event which triggers the war is that in June 1950, North Korea decides to attack South Korea, and Kim's forces cross the 30th parallel and capture Seoul very, very quickly, because it was quite close to the border, and push the South Korean forces to this little area here. This wee area here, if I can just draw on this map, I think I can, around the city of Busan. Today it's called Busan. And this area became known as the Busan Pocket. Okay. So they pushed the forces back to here. And America reacted very, very quickly. It went to the United Nations and called on the United Nations to back an armed campaign against the North Koreans. Okay. So at the UN, America was given permission to send a force, a United Nations force, into South Korea to push the North Koreans back over the 30th parallel. And the job of doing this was given to this guy here, Douglas MacArthur, who had a strange taste in pipes. But General Douglas MacArthur was given control of this United Nations force. It had a coalition of 16 countries, okay? But most of the soldiers were Americans. So really it was America taking action, not the United Nations. Douglas MacArthur took his orders from President Truman as well, not from the United Nations. But what the United Nations was prepared to say was that the United Nations force could push the North Koreans back over the 30th parallel, and that's all. So, in September 1950, the UN forces land at Incheon, and within a few months, they had actually pushed the North Korean forces out of South Korea. Okay, by October 1950, the UN force invade North Korea, but this exceeds the orders. So what MacArthur does, once he gets the North Koreans on the run, he pushes them over the 30th parallel, and he keeps going, and he actually keeps going right up to the Yalu River. Now the Yalu River is right on the border with China, and it looks like maybe MacArthur might actually invade China as well. Okay, so he captures Pyongyang. Pyongyang is here. They reach the Yalu River, and MacArthur wants to use the atomic bomb in China. So MacArthur is now calling on America to give him nukes so that he can nuke China. So this is a very dangerous period in history, as you can see. But at that point, the Chinese fight back, and they raise an army of 250,000 soldiers, a huge army, 250,000 men. If one thing China's got, it's got a lot of people. And they invade North Korea, and they push the UN forces back over the border again to 30th parallel, and they recapture Seoul. Okay, I sometimes think about the Korean War a bit like a yo-yo. It's going up and down this Korean peninsula. Okay, first they invade, then the Americans invaded back, then the Chinese invaded. Okay, and the Chinese had the backing of Stalin for this. A lot of the weapons that the Chinese soldiers were using were Russian weapons. And in fact, later on in the war, the Chinese began to use fighter planes, and the fighter planes are actually piloted by Russian pilots dressed in Chinese uniforms. Okay, you might want to think about that. Why does Russia not want to get involved directly? Well, it's obvious. Russia doesn't want to get into an all-out war with America, but it's prepared to back other countries which are fighting the Americans. So we call that a proxy war, where you use somebody else to do your fighting for you. Okay, proxy war, Proxy. Right, so what finally happens is that over the space of the next 2 years, a battle is fought along this line. Then eventually, peace is agreed along the 30th parallel. The results of the war are that the USA has proven that it's going to get involved in smaller countries like Korea to stop the spread of communism. It leads to the death of 2 million people, this war. But also it sort of sets a precedent for things like the Vietnam War. It shows that America is going to get involved. Korea, the consequences for Korea. Korea remains divided to this day along the 30th parallel. There's still that ceasefire line there, and there's an area called the DMZ, the demilitarized zone, if you remember back to the first slide that I showed you. This is where these two guys are at, Kim Jong-il, sorry, and former President Donald Trump. And they're standing in the DMZ, the demilitarized zone, where neither North Korea or South Korea are allowed to keep their armies. And this side of the concrete line here is North Korea, and this side is South Korea. And you can see what they're doing is they're stepping over the line. Okay, and it's a symbolic thing where they're symbolically stepping over the border, and they quickly step back again, I think, as well. There was no invasion or anything like that. So it's still an area of tension in the world. It's still a remnant of the Cold War. It's still a hangover from the Cold War, if you like, a hangover from the Second World War. The Korea is still divided to this day along the 30th parallel.